Hi, it's Supreme Court Justice Paul Thissen. I want to thank the students at Shakopee High School for the great questions that they sent in. I'm going to try to cover a lot of them here in the next 15 minutes or so. Um, One of the questions was interesting to me, a good question, is whether 25 years of working as a practicing lawyer was enough and it was a good time for me to switch to be a judge. I think that that is for sure the case, yes. Even as a lawyer, I kind of moved into different areas. I started out as a litigator, meaning going to court representing corporations and other businesses largely in their lawsuits with other people. For a while, I also worked as a transactional lawyer, so putting together deals or advising people on the regulatory, the kind of the rules they have to comply with, put down by the government, especially in healthcare and long-term care areas. I worked a couple years as a public defender. So even as a lawyer, I tried a lot of new things, and I did a lot of pro bono work. So moving into kind of areas that I didn't typically practice to help people that couldn't otherwise afford a lawyer, to pay a lawyer. And I also spent 16 years in the legislature. And in both those cases, after a while, you become stale in your job, and I'm not being challenged in the same way. And so it was time for me to try something new. And I'm very excited that I'm able to do it, in particular because one of the things I really love about this new job as a judge is that I get to really think hard about things and have the time to do that. When you're a practicing lawyer or you're in the legislature, you're often reacting to things as they happen instead of being able to step back and really think hard and think through them. What's my average workday? Someone asked. A lot of my work, quite frankly, is reading and writing. Reading the opinions that we've written before, the cases that we've written before, reading statutes, reading articles about a particular area of law, and then, of course, reading the parties' briefs and the arguments that they're making to the court, and then writing our opinions. And so a lot of my time is spent doing that. It's almost the question really. My cycle more is a kind of on a monthly basis. We hear arguments the first 2 weeks of every month. So in the morning of the first 2 weeks of every month, we hear usually two cases in oral argument. And then in the afternoon, we're kind of preparing for the next day's oral argument. So a lot of the first 2 weeks is really focused on the cases that we're hearing before us and need to decide or at least vote on that day. And then the second 2 weeks of the month are largely spent either reviewing petitions for review, so cases that people want us to take, or writing the opinions in the cases that we've already heard. But that's really what a lot of the work that I do is, and how I spend much of my day. There's a couple questions which I was glad about public defenders and their jobs and how they work. One of the questions was whether public defenders get enough funding. My answer would be no. I think that they're very busy. There's a lot of criminal cases, a lot of people that can't afford a lawyer in criminal cases, and it's a constitutional right to be represented by a lawyer in a criminal case. And so we do need, there's no question, I don't think anybody would dispute that we need more funding for public defenders so that they can have lower caseloads, so that they can have less stressful lives. I mean, it's a very stressful job to be dealing with really kind of tragedies in many senses every day, not from the defendant's perspective, but also from the victim's perspective. And so they do kind of God's work, and we really need, I think, to fund them much better than we do. Public defenders do. Someone asked whether public defenders appear in front of our court as well through the appellate process, and there's a constitutional right to counsel, to have a public defender at your trial representing you. And in Minnesota, we have made it a priority, and we have the law in place that you get a public defender all the way through at least one appeal, through your first appeal. If you come back and try to challenge your case in the future, you're not entitled constitutionally to a public defender. But it works from the trial to the appellate courts all the way up to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Someone asked whether, well, now I got to look at my notes more closely, something that I would change about the law or legal services. And I think if there was one change that I would make, it would be to make sure that in the civil side, so cases like eviction cases, that where there's not a threat that you're going to go to jail or to prison, which is a criminal case. The other kind of sets of cases are civil cases. So contract disputes, eviction cases, family law cases, all of those kind of things. There's no constitutional right to a lawyer. in the United States. The Gideon case, which established the right to a lawyer, is just for criminal cases, and that's why we have public defenders. And I think, as I said in my presentation, our legal aid system and our pro bono system is under a lot of pressure. There's just way too many people that can't afford a lawyer that have real legal needs. And so if there's one thing I would change about our system kind of radically, it would be to create what we'd call civil Gideon. So basically to create a public defender system for poor people who can't afford a lawyer for their civil cases. You know, if they're going to be evicted, if they're facing debt collection, if they have a contract dispute, if they have a family law case. Because I think that it would be better for the courts. I think there'd be more legitimacy and trust that the courts are going to come to the right conclusion. It would certainly be better for those individuals to make sure that their rights are really being articulated and they're being assisted in navigating the system. Just kind of from a fundamental fairness perspective, I think that would be a change that we would make. That would be a good one to make. And someone asked, interestingly, are there cases that slip through the cracks for lack of funding? And I think the answer to that is clearly yes as well. I mean, there just are a lot of people who have real legal needs, real legal rights, that because they can't afford a lawyer, they don't understand what rights they actually do have, or they can't figure out how to navigate the system, and so they just give up. And that's unfortunate, and it, again, leads to a little bit of lack of trust that our justice system truly is about justice. And so that's why we need to make bigger commitment as a society to making sure that everybody has access to legal counsel in a meaningful way. Someone asked about, is the state system like the federal system in the sense that when someone steps down from being judge, retires from being judge, is someone new appointed or is there an election? You know, typically it's an appointment by the governor. Just because it's time, you know, the timing is right, and that's how it works. Very rarely, once in a while, because of the timing of a retirement, there has to be an election, and that's happened in the past. Justice Alan Page actually was elected, you know, the former Viking, but also an amazing justice for 20 plus years in the state of Minnesota. He ran and won an election for an open seat because someone had reached retirement age and there was no time to do an appointment before the election. But generally speaking, you know, judges in Minnesota are appointed by the governor in the first instance. But then we do have to run for election every 6 years. And it's a different kind of election. And there's, you know, because you can't really talk about issues like someone running for president or someone running for state representative. You can talk about school funding and kind of all those political issues that get debated. As a judge, when I run for office, I can't talk about those types of things. So I talk about the way our system works, access to justice, fairness, the type of judge that I am, kind of a little bit about my philosophy of you know, judging, which is, you know, really to making sure that we're hearing everybody's voice in the courts and we're being respectful and you know, respecting the legislature's decisions, all of those kind of things. So it's a little bit different kind of an election. The other big difference for judges, unlike other politicians, is as a judge, I can't ask anybody for money to help fund my campaign. I have to have other people do that, and I can't know who's giving to me. You know, the reason for that is to make sure that people feel like our system is being, the people are being judged on the merits of their case, you know, instead of the influence of money and all of those kind of things. And so that is one other difference between elections for judges and elections for other people in our political system. Someone asked if I ever wished an outcome on a case would be different, and I guess I have a couple answers on that. One is I don't think any of the decisions I've been on so far, I think the case was necessarily decided wrong, or I would change my vote or my opinion. Maybe in a few on the margin, but not where it would have mattered in terms of the outcome of the case. So from that perspective, no. But there are, you know, and part of that is because we have to follow the law, and our job is to do what the legislature intended in a lot of cases. You know, so would I have made a different decision in passing a law? Yes, in some cases that would have been the case. I would have adopted a different policy. But once the legislature adopts the policy, my job is not to question that decision, but to implement what the legislature said. And in that case, you know, most of the votes that I've taken, I feel very, very comfortable with. But there are lots of cases from a different perspective where I wish the outcome would have been different. In particular, you know, criminal cases, you know, where you can just see as you're reading the case and kind of how the crime developed, If someone would have made a different decision in a particular moment, just even a small decision in a particular moment, the crime wouldn't have happened, the tragedy wouldn't have happened. There wouldn't be the victim, and the impact that someone being victimized has on that person and their families. The defendant wouldn't be facing, prison and going to jail for a long time. So many cases just turn on those momentary decisions where people just make a bad judgment, and it kind of causes these terrible consequences. And so in those cases, I often find myself wishing I could just turn back the clock and to the point right before that decision and just really encourage that person to make a different, smarter, more responsible decision, because things would have turned out, so much differently for everybody involved. Um, Someone asked about the most difficult or the most controversial cases that we get. To me, I think the most difficult cases are those cases where there are two kind of values or rights that come into conflict with each other. So for instance, we have laws about what's called defamation. It's basically, you can't say something false about someone that hurts their reputation. And that's an important value. We want individual dignity. We want to make sure that people's reputations are protected. But we also have the First Amendment and this idea that people should be able to speak freely, and we don't want to put laws in place that are going to, undermine their ability or their feeling that they can speak freely in a democratic society. And so balancing kind of the freedom to speak freely with the need to defend people's reputations. You see this all the time, right, in social media, where people are saying terrible things about people, is particularly in the political context, and you don't know what's true or not. And how do we balance out those two competing values? Another example, actually, it was a case out of Shakopee, a different First Amendment case, about free speech and safety, and what the rules are in terms of kind of abusive behavior on the internet. So balancing the need to keep people safe and to keep people safe. That's the word. Balance that out with the right of people to again express themselves freely. Those are really, really hard cases, the hardest cases from my perspective. Someone did ask about, I think this is from the legislature, my legislative career, how many votes are taken. So from a legislative perspective, every year legislators take hundreds of votes, mostly on amendments. So the bills come through, the laws that are proposed to be passed, and then people can offer amendments to change parts of that law. And there's lots and lots of votes on those things. But the number of actual bills that have been passed in the legislature from when I started in 2003 to when I retired in 2018, the number of actual bills passed went down dramatically because people started to put lots and lots of different laws in what we call omnibus bills. So bills that include, some people call them Christmas tree bills because they include different laws that are all lumped together in a big group. And one of the reasons the legislature does that is because it, if someone likes one part of it and someone else likes another part of it, they can just get more people to vote for the bills. It's kind of an incentive to bring more people along to get to the majority you need to pass a bill. I think it's actually a bad trend in our legislature, both as a legislator when I was there, because it reduces transparency, what people know what they're voting on. They don't always read all of the bills. And it doesn't give you a clean vote on really important issues to your constituents. So you go along with stuff you don't agree with because you want to get the stuff you actually agree with. And that's not the best spot for us to be in. For judges, frankly, it's not that great either, because it's harder for us to understand really what the legislature wanted to do when it passed a lot of these bills. If that question about voting was about the Supreme Court, we address about 120 to 140 cases every year and vote on those. Someone asked about my proudest moment on the Supreme Court. That was a tricky one to think about, but one of the things that I am proud of, I think in the video that you watched before, we talked about at the Supreme Court, we don't have to take every case. We get to choose which cases we take. And I think the things that I've maybe most been proud of is where I've convinced my colleagues to take a case that, they might not have otherwise taken. And then when we take the case, we actually make some important new law, and sometimes kind of rectify a wrong decision below. I think those might be the things I'm most proud of. So in the 2 years that I've been on the court so far, kind of making sure that people's voices again are really heard. And so I guess that would be my answer on that. Um, and then there's a question about moment. There was a question about have there been moments in some of the jobs that I've had that um, I'm most proud of, or that have made a big. I think it was have made a biggest impact on my life. And certainly there are. I mean, some of them are just those moments that you really remember. For me in the legislature, one was the day when I was Speaker of the House when we passed marriage equality. It was a pretty incredible experience. The House, which is kind of a raucous place at many times, and often people aren't always in their seats and aren't always listening. That day, everybody took the debate incredibly seriously. And it was a really good debate. I mean, people were very respectful. They spoke from their hearts. They spoke about their own personal experiences. It was a powerful day on the floor, and there were thousands of people at the Capitol watching, kind of interested on both sides. And I have to say that day, as I kind of presided over the House, was probably the most memorable experience I had there. The work in my legal career, I would say, probably were the pro bono cases that I took. A death penalty case in Texas where we got a person freed from death row. He's now a minister down in Texas because he didn't commit a capital crime. Those kind of things are where I feel like you make the biggest difference in people's lives. But I also have to say, thinking about this from a different perspective, I guess the biggest moments or the best moments as I look back on my career and my life are the moments when I've taken a chance and tried something new. When I decided to run for office for the first time in 2002, without really thinking too hard about it, but just said, well, why not give it a chance? I took a few years off from my legal practice at the law firm. I worked part-time at the law firm, but to go work for the public defender's office. Another great informative experience that gave me a lot of that exposed me to a lot of new law, not a lot of new professional experiences. Those types of things. Applying for the Supreme Court when that position came up. It wasn't kind of a traditional. I didn't take a traditional path to the Supreme Court, and then I have to say, there's times, maybe the best of those times are when I've tried something and it didn't always work out. When I ran for governor in 2010. I started running in 2008 and traveled all across the state, met some amazing people, learned a great deal about Minnesotans and Minnesota, and made some very, very dear friends in the process. And we actually did really well, but didn't quite make it to winning the race. But that experience clearly had an impact on the rest of my career. It clearly had an impact on how I understood my job and my values. And still today, those experiences I had traveling across the state then, and then as a result of that, I became the leader of the Democrats in the House, and continue to travel across the state and meet with people in a very different way. I still carry that with me in my heart, in my head, when I do this job on the Supreme Court, and I think it helps me make decisions that are right for Minnesotans and in a more effective way. So if there's anything, I guess I would say in response to that is, when opportunities come up, seize them and take a chance, even if you don't know how it's going to turn out, because regardless, in many cases, how it turns, whether it turns out as you expected, you're going to take a lot away from it. So I really appreciate the questions. Again, if you have any further questions or thoughts, you can email me at paul.thissen@courts.state.mnus. And otherwise, I hope you enjoy the remainder of your school year here and have a great summer. Thanks.